Hello, and welcome to another installment of Frost Talk. I'm the prospector, and I look for those nuggets of truth in the rivers of current cultural trends. Today I'm going to talk about ESG and DEI, and what they mean to you. First, what do these acronyms represent? ESG refers to the score given to a corporation that gauges its environmental, social, and governance behaviors. The environmental portion of the score is easy to understand. It speaks of how well a particular company supports and protects the environment. However, it goes a bit beyond the simplistic concepts of just not polluting or even recycling. The environmental score is also affected by current trends in environmentalism. Since climate change has been embraced by the world's leaders, companies now have to show how they are cutting their carbon footprint. The Biden administration has promoted a net zero policy which seeks to make the entire country carbon neutral by the year 2050. It is important to note that this restriction on business only applies to American businesses. It will not affect how large a carbon footprint companies outside the U.S. have. The argument is made that without U.S. leadership, other countries will have no reason to comply with the UN carbon restrictions. But the obvious counter-argument is that if the U.S. is hobbling its own industry, it would make perfect sense not to do so to your own industries and thus profit off of the vacuum that is left. Or worse, the movement of U.S. businesses out of the country to more business-friendly countries will have a corresponding loss of jobs for the U.S. market. It is the social and governance aspects of ESG that are a little bit murkier. This is where DEI comes in. DEI scores corporations and companies on their diversity, equity, and inclusion behaviors. Anyone who has either attended a college course or worked in a corporation with a DEI executive will understand the meanings of these words. But for the sake of clarity, let me define them for you. Diversity, the portion of the score that looks at how diverse your workforce, business practices, and leadership positions are. Diversity refers to age, ethnic, gender, and even physical disabilities. The equity score should not be confused with equality. Equality assumes that all people are treated the same. Equity has a different connotation. It looks at the circumstances of the individual and decides if they need to be given special treatment in order to make up for some sort of perceived societal wrong. This is where the idea of white privilege comes in. In the words of Bill Sheninger, all interns are created equal. We pay them nothing. The people who can afford an entire summer without getting paid are likely already coming from a position of privilege. In other words, someone who cannot afford that position should not only get the position, but should be paid for it according to the standards of equity. Finally, inclusion. This refers to the mix of the workforce within the workplace. It looks at people who fall into the needing equity and determines how many of those should be placed into those positions. Diana Ellsworth states, the LGBTQ community is underrepresented in the workplace, especially at more senior levels, and as a result, many feel like a, quote, only, unquote, at work, and are more likely to experience microaggressions. Criticism of inclusion practices point out that the attitude that some require special treatment based upon their either physical or mental characteristics often will stoke resentment amongst the workforce that worked hard for their positions. Recently, the Supreme Court struck down the idea of using racial quotas to fill university classrooms. Opponents thought that this was somehow a racist position, but instead, I believe it to be a much more compassionate one. A person who is placed in a classroom or position based simply on their skin color faces the suspicion from others, and sometimes even themselves, that they really don't belong, and have taken that spot from someone more deserving. Then, let's say a person placed in this position is unable to do well in the world that they were placed into. When they fail, they have not only deprived someone else of success, but have also set themselves back away from a pathway that could have offered them more success. What is the purpose of ESG scores? Supporters will say that investors have a right to know how socially acceptable a company's practices are beyond the financial. Without such a score, investors won't know whether or not a company is operating in bad faith. But in reality, it's a way for environmentally and socially conscious people to control the behavior of a corporation that is larger than themselves. By making such a score public or making investment decisions based upon this score, they can steer companies into more, quote, responsible methods of action. However, like any power, the wielder themselves has to be responsible. While campaigns like environmentalism, pay and gender gaps, consumer protections, and data privacy all are altruistic, the reality is often different than the stated goals. While it's good to protect the environment, this goal frequently ventures into the feel-good environmentalism, doing things that sound great but do little. Recycling is a great example of this. We all decry the amount of plastic that is used, but feel as long as we are recycling the plastic, then it's okay to use that plastic. But in reality, only 5% of all plastic is recycled in the U.S. Where does the other 95% go? Mostly to landfills. Electric cars are the new cure for global climate change. But most electric producers in the U.S. still utilize carbon-producing methods of energy production. In my area, they're talking about building a new power plant to support the greater influx of these new electric cars. Great, I'm all for that. Only the new power plant is going to burn natural gas to produce that electricity. Well, wait a minute. I was just told that my natural gas stove was polluting and that I needed to switch to an electric one. Well, as we have seen in this country, the racial divide has only gotten worse instead of better with these programs. Despite the fact that we voted in a black president and currently have a black female president, and we have record numbers of both racially and gender diverse people sitting in boardrooms across America, and despite that in 2021, of the top 65 universities polled, all of them had an average of 45 employees whose sole job it was to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have about 101 medical schools across America that have implemented diversity initiatives in their admission practices. Despite all of that, we still have riots and unrest. So how do these scores affect you? As I said before, the scores allow special interest groups to adjust the policies of corporations in ways that are not always apparent to those who are truly affected by them. Until the recent Supreme Court decision, your ethnicity allowed universities to deny admission to those who are obviously qualified in order to admit those who didn't quite meet those same admission criteria, but did meet their diversity goals. If you think, well, I'm not white, and that only applies to white people, then think again. The plaintiffs in that Supreme Court case were Asian. And now universities are already trying to come up with ways around that Supreme Court's decision. Very soon, Hispanics will be the majority in America. What happens when Ivy League universities begin to deny them admission due to their majority status? Then there's the Biden mortgage socialism. You may be required to pay higher interest rates or mortgage fees on your home in order to provide equitable housing to those groups that those in power support. And already happening, your options for investment may be limited to companies that have high ESG scores, but still perform badly. What happens when your 401k is banned from investment in oil companies and instead has to invest in failing companies like the Solyndra scam years ago? Now, let me tell you, there are a great number of those on Capitol Hill that are decrying the obscene oil profits and yet are also invested in those very same companies in order to capitalize on those very same profits. Woke policy in the entertainment industry has resulted in abysmal products. Writers who cannot write, actors placed in roles solely to capitalize on their diversity instead of their ability to act, storylines that are designed more to instruct us on how to think rather than to entertain us. This has resulted in major losses after major losses for studios. Now those same writers who are writing garbage are striking to get more money writing the stuff people aren't going out to the theaters to see in the first place. We are seeing sexuality being taught to our children at younger ages. Nearly every piece of media in front of them teaches them to not only be sexual creatures themselves, but also serves to confuse them with alternative lifestyle messages. Promotion of diversity in our schools often includes critical race theory, which not only teaches our children incorrect history, but also stokes animosity between races for perceived wrongs. And what about those programs at work that instruct us on diversity? Coca-Cola was recently caught with a diversity program that taught white employees that they are inherently guilty of acts committed in the past by individuals unrelated to them. And as a result, they must carry the guilt of inequity. And these examples are only the tip of the iceberg. I don't know if you've heard of the hedonic treadmill, but the idea goes like this. When you do something for yourself, it gives you a high, well, like buying a new car. Then other purchases tend to pale in comparison. And in order to achieve that same euphoric feeling, you must go on to bigger and better things. The cycle never ends because to get off the treadmill means that you will have to deal with the more mundane things in life. These ESG principles are very similar. I like to call it the woke treadmill. You can never achieve the stated goals of the scorekeepers because once everybody does it, a 10 score becomes average, and you must come up with newer and better things for people to achieve in order to keep that ESG train going. Because to stop doing so will give those who dole out the scores nothing to do, and they too must keep their jobs going and their industry going. So what's happening now? We are beginning to see the backlash of a world gone woke. The American giant is waking up and he's somewhat pissed. Bud Light ignited a firestorm with placing a trans influencer on some of their cans. Even though this was not an actual ad campaign, the fury was quick and shocking for the makers of America's #1 beer. Immediately, online outrage reached a fever pitch. Previously, no one worried about companies supporting LGBTQ causes, but no one wanted the face of it to grace the aluminum skin of their beer. Stocks dropped precipitously. Executives were fired. Stocks continued to plummet. Half-assed public statements were made, and sales dropped to the point where a Mexican beer replaced Bud Light as America's preferred beer. Recently, even Costco turned their back on the brewer and dropped them from their stores. Now, the department store Target should have read the room, but it did not. The famously pro-gay company decided to go into Pride Month with large displays right at their front entrances. Clothing was designed for trans individuals and placed on sale. LGBTQ-friendly clothing designed by an avowed Satanist was marketed, and sometimes to children. Again, public outcry was swift, and Target lost massive revenue as people stopped going to their stores. They were forced to either put away the offensive articles or at least move them to the back of their store. New activist groups such as Gays Against Groomers have arisen. It is their stance that radical factions within the LGBTQ group have hijacked the movement and turned it into something it was never meant to be. They wanted the ability to love the people they wanted to love and marry them. It is now turned into the grooming of children, and that is as abhorrent to them as it is to any straight person. As their numbers grow, so does their influence and their message. Currently, many online social media outlets seek to ban them for misinformation. But they are still growing, and they have an increasingly large straight following as well. Disney had an executive some time ago speak publicly about their not-so-secret gay agenda. It was largely ignored by the mainstream media, but what was not ignored was the slew of alternative lifestyle characters moviegoers noticed. And now Disney suffers failure after failure at the box office. Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, he's not moved by the hundreds of millions of dollars that Disney and, by extension, their shareholders have lost. He vows to continue on with the agenda. Having said all that, we are seeing a movement in the upper echelons of the corporate world. ESG executives are losing their jobs at astounding rates. Gone are Latondra Newton of Disney, Karen Horn of Warner Brothers, Verna Myers of Netflix, and Film Academy's Janelle English. Executives at Amazon, Meta, Twitter, and Redfin have all been axed. Furthermore, listing for DEI jobs, which were the fastest growing job market over the last 5 years, are now suddenly down 19% from last year, according to LinkedIn. The world's largest investment firm, BlackRock, with nearly $8 billion in investments, has pushed this ESG agenda by not allowing its investors to invest in corporations with low ESG scores. It has now seemingly softened on the idea. The CEO of BlackRock, the appropriately named Larry Fink, stated, "I don't use the word ESG anymore because it's been entirely weaponized by the far left and weaponized by the far right," saying he is now ashamed at being part of the conversation, a conversation that he was instrumental in bringing to the forefront of investors' minds. He proposed a new term of conscientious capitalism. But don't hold your breath. A turd by any other name is still just a turd. But even this behemoth of a firm is having problems. Investor Bluebell Capital is seeking to oust CEO Larry Fink over his ESG agenda. So what is the future of ESG? Well, the Supreme Court's Harvard decision could very well have long-lasting effects against ESG. Previously, corporate America had a body of legislation to shield them from claims of racism in hiring practices. People who fail to get the jobs that they qualify for, or worse, lose their jobs in order to promote diversity hires, will now have a stronger legal recourse. Companies now understand that they have to balance their ESG scores against the lost revenue of a public that is just tired of having everyone's special agenda pushed at them. The agenda-driven purveyors of ESG believe that if they just wait this out, the giant will eventually go back to sleep, and they will be free to return to their preaching of the new religion, the DEI. They believe that we are having a temper tantrum. We need to keep up the fight. We need to continue to remind them that they work for us, not vice versa. Without the consumer, they are nothing. Alternative companies will always arrive to fill the void left by the woke. And maybe the ESG score is a good thing. Maybe we can use it for our own purposes and start investing in companies that align with our own values. BlackRock has made it easy for us to identify them. They are likely the corporations with not so good ESG scores. This is The Prospector with your nugget of truth for today. Good day, and go out there and give 'em hell.